Okay, we'll start. Hello, everyone. I'm Rola Kiladjian. I'm the Communications Officer at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. Thank you for joining us. This is our fourth webinar in the Thinking Critically with Palestine series. This webinar is titled Palestine in Academia and Media. The language of this webinar will be English, but translation to Arabic is available for those registered over Zoom. We welcome your questions. Please send them to the Q&A over Zoom or to the comments section on our Facebook page. We will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. I will now hand over to Dr. Satani Shami, the Director General of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, who will be followed by Dr. Dina Khoury, Professor Emerita of History at George Washington University and a member of the Board of Trustees at the ACS and at the Dawha Institute. Dr. Dina will be moderating this webinar. Satani?
Thank you, Rola. Can you hear me well? Yes. Welcome, everyone, to our fourth webinar in our Palestine series. Ramadan Kareem, in spite of the grim and dark times that we are living in. I will give you a little bit of background on the series and the way we have been thinking about these conversations at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. So the series was developed in close consultation with the ACSS Board of Trustees, and over several weeks of discussion, the series took shape and the speakers were invited. I would like to thank the board for their hard work in developing these webinars. And also members of the board have chaired and moderated some of the webinars, and I thank Dr. Dina Khoury for chairing this one. The first two webinars were held in Arabic, the third in English, and this fourth one is also in English, but of course, as Rola mentioned, with translation into Arabic. And by switching languages in the webinars, we aim at reaching somewhat different audiences, regionally and globally. Although we always have a solid core of participants who follow our activities online, and I see that they are with us today, and we welcome them. The topics addressed so far in the webinars have been, the first webinar was entitled The Resonance of Palestine in Arab Contexts. The second was entitled Imagining Decolonial Futures Through Palestine. The third was called Critical Theory Encounters Palestine. And this webinar that we have today is Palestine in Academia and Media. In these webinars, we are, of course, centrally concerned with the present day ravaging and erasure of Palestine.
I'm sorry, we lost the electricity, the power. Just give us 1 minute, we will fix the problem.
I'm back, I think. Sorry about that. That's the electricity cuts that happen, unexpectedly in Beirut. So I'm back. So I was saying, in these webinars, we're, of course, centrally concerned with present-day ravaging and erasure of Palestine. But we would also like to look at how what is happening today reopens the past and histories of Palestine and the region in new ways, in addition to pointing towards multiple possible futures. In these webinars, Palestine is not only a geopolitical space of struggle, aggression, and hegemony, although these issues themselves would take up many hours of discussion and thought. Palestine is also an example, a paradigm, a litmus test, a challenge to think with and to think through. In this series, we think together with Palestine, in solidarity with Palestine, but are also cognizant of the lessons it embodies for other places and other times. We hope that in this webinar and in this series, we lay the groundwork for intellectual agendas with real-world applications, and we also hope to thicken and expand the network of concerned social scientists and humanists who struggle for justice and peace through their work. Once again, thanks to those who helped organize this webinar, thanks to our speaker and moderator and translators, and most of all, thanks to our listeners and participants over Facebook and Zoom. I hand over to Dr. Dina Khoury now. Dina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Satani. Ramadan Kareem, and welcome, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. I also welcome our speakers who took time from very busy schedules to be with us today. Today, what we're going to talk about is how Palestine has worked and continues to work itself through the academia and the media. And Palestine, as most of you know, has for some time been the locus, both in the Arab world and in the academy, Western academy, the locus of how we think about colonialism and decolonization, about solidarity and resistance. But I think the current genocide in Gaza has changed the rules of engagement in both the academy and the media. And our guest speakers today are uniquely qualified to speak on these matters. I'll introduce them in the order that they will be speaking to you, and then ask them then to follow one another after and each will speak for about 20 minutes. We begin, and these are brief biographies of scholars that I had to give in shorthand. Professor Ussama Makdisi is Professor of History and Chancellor's Chair at the University of California at Berkeley. He's written 4 books, and I'll just mention 2. His most recent book, Age of Coexistence, The Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World. And he's also the author of Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries in the Failed Conversion of the Middle East, which won 3 book awards. He has published widely on Ottoman and Arab history, as well as on U.S.-Arab relations and U.S. missionary work in the Middle East. He's also actively involved in public-facing scholarship, including writing the Middle East, in the Middle East Eye and Jacobin, and he and his brother co-host a podcast called Makdisi Street. He will be followed by Professor Amahl Bishara, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology at Tufts University. She's author of Crossing a Line, Laws, Violence, and Roadblocks to Palestinian Political Expression. Her first book, Backstories, U.S. News and Palestinian Politics, is an ethnography of the production of U.S. news during the Second Palestinian Intifada. Professor Hanan Sabea is Associate Professor of Anthropology and Editor-in-Chief of Cairo Papers in Social Sciences at the American University in Cairo. Her research examines the temporalities of land and labor on plantations in Africa, state-subject relations, and the production of histories. Her current research focuses on imagining the political, gendered violence and legal exclusion, and knowledge production in the social sciences. Ussama, I turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Dina, and طبعا مساء الخير, صباح الخير, ورمضان Kareem. So as Dina said, I'm a professor of history here at UC Berkeley, and I'd like to start with the obvious, which is to say that like so many, I would say, professors, like so many students, like so many people in this country, in the United States, I've been shocked by the events in Gaza, the genocide, the extraordinary brutality, the extraordinary obviousness of a genocide that's live streamed in 2023, 2024 on the one hand. And I've been incredibly, and we can talk about this later, I've been incredibly um, surprised and gratified by the amount of solidarity at the student level, both here at UC Berkeley and across this country, and at the assistant level, at the junior level of the faculty ranks and the lecturers. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I've been stunned, as many of you have been, no doubt. Anyone who knows the United States or the West, Germany, France, the UK, all of us have been stunned by the degree to which the silence, on the one hand, in academia and in high culture, or even worse, the complicity and the support for Israel in its genocide, despite its genocide, has been absolutely stunning. So the question for me is to figure out what is the relationship between the solidarity that's building at a youth level, also in academia, versus the complicity and the silence and the overwhelming hypocrisy of Western governments that have supported Israel consistently from October 7th, before October 7th, after October 7th. And sort of the audience here at the ACSS obviously doesn't need any lectures about the history of Western hypocrisy or Western racism or the double standard of Western states vis-a-vis the Arab world and especially the Palestinians. But what you may not know, what most people don't know, and of course the hypocrisy of Arab countries as well, one has to say, what most of us don't know is the degree to which UC Berkeley and all Western academic institutions reflect and are part of the Western order of things. These universities, despite their reputations, despite the fact that they claim to be bastions and centers of academic freedom and freedom of thought and critical thinking, these universities institutionally do not challenge the Western hegemony and the Western order of things, but work consistently to polish the most violent and aggressive edges of this order of things. And for this reason, any of you who have ever visited the US or have ever visited Germany or have ever visited the UK will have certainly noticed, especially in the US, that virtually every campus in the United States, virtually every institution in the United States today commemorates, makes a very important and intricate show of commemorating slavery, the history of the past, the history of the oppression of Black Americans, the history of genocide against Native Americans, although they don't often use the term genocide, but they acknowledge Native Americans. There are these things called land acknowledgements that sometimes get read in the United States, but also in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand. There are there's a constant commemoration of past violence. On the other hand, there's also extraordinary silence when it comes to Palestine. So the question for me is, what is the relationship between this sort of culture of commemoration of past violence versus silence about present violence? So what explains this? Is it a question of hypocrisy? Is it a question of cognitive dissonance? Is it a question of racism? Is it a question of something else? So for me, the answer, it's a complicated answer, but the answer is essentially, it's not a paradox. The commemoration on the one hand of past injustices versus the silence on Palestine, or the complicity in the genocide of the Palestinians. I don't think it's a paradox. I think it actually reflects the nature of Western academic historiography and Western morality, if I can generalize. So to make it put it in more concrete terms, there's no academic today that I'm aware of anywhere in Western academia who will openly support or identify with segregation, whether it's in the US South, whether it's in apartheid South Africa, when there's no academic certainly who will support and say they support Nazi Germany or support any form of extreme injustice. Yet at the same time, there are many academics, including the chancellor of my university, who will openly say that they identify with Israel and will openly say that the Palestinian story, these are her words recently in an interview, the chancellor, in other words, is the academic leader of the university here, who says that the Palestinian story, as deeply felt as it is by people who support Palestine, is, quote, wrong. And so it's an extraordinary thing for a chancellor to say. And so for me, the question is, what does it mean for a chancellor to say, on the one hand, that they commemorate slavery and they condemn slavery in the past and they change the names of buildings across this university and across universities in this country? They take down the names of people who they today identify as racist against blacks and against Native Americans. And on the other hand, you have the same universities who insist that the Palestinian story is, quote, wrong, or who openly identify with Israel. How does one make sense of this double standard, or this dualism? And there are several reasons I want to get into. The first reason is clearly about, there's a very obvious reason. One is, of course, that universities in general respond to the political culture in which they're in, which is to say, there is a huge, without any doubt, a huge systematic, organized campaign of pro-Israel lobbying. There are donors. There is enormous pressure put on every single institution in this country to make sure that they don't take a moral and ethical position on the question of Palestine. That's clear. So there's a material explanation. But there's a more fundamental, and I think older explanation, an older history that goes back to the question of Western Orientalism and Western racism that continually devalues Palestinian non-Western life. The third reason is the fact that past commemorations are about the past. They don't actually threaten the sovereignty or the sense of permanence of Western societies, whereas Palestinian resistance and Palestinian existence until this very moment still threatens, at least in the perception of the West and the Israelis, still threatens the very idea of what the Zionist state is all about. So there's a sense of you can't really commemorate something that actually threatens sovereignty. And the fourth reason, probably the most important, is the fact that this Western double standard, the Western sort of demonization of Palestinians, the Western demonization of contemporary resistance, is tied to something that happened after World War II. And this, if I have to sort of generalize most broadly, it's this point. After World War II in the West, two things or three things happened, and I think we need to be aware of them. The first thing that happened was a sense of the need in the West and among Western academia, Western philosophy, Western thinkers, critical thinkers, liberal theologians, not liberation, but liberal theologians, and others. There was a sense of the need to reconstitute a Western sense of self after the horrors of World War II. And so what happened after World War II is that, on the one hand, Western philosophers, politicians, thinkers, writers, both on the left and on the right, or on the conservative side and on the liberal side, overwhelmingly sort of recognized that part and parcel of Western culture that had to be dealt with was the question of Western anti-Semitism, which culminated in the Holocaust. And so there was a sense in the West that there was a need on the part of Western academia, as well as Western thinkers, as well as Western theologians, to grapple with the question of the Holocaust and the question of anti-Semitism. At the same time, however, there was a complete refusal, or almost a total refusal, on the part of these same Western institutions, these same Western thinkers, these same Western theologians, to grapple seriously with the question of colonialism. So there's a bifurcation that takes place between, on the one hand, the question of anti-Semitism in the West versus the question of colonialism. And so in the West, one could, after World War II, one could sort of come to terms, or think that they were coming to terms with the question of anti-Semitism and the history of Western anti-Semitism, without actually coming to terms with the history of Western colonialism, and without relating the two, without understanding the relationship between the Nazis on the one hand and Western racism and Western genocidal policies and thinking vis-a-vis the non-Western world. And this bifurcation is extremely important to understand, because this is what allows people in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s in Western academia to increasingly think of the Holocaust separate from the history of colonialism. And so, and this is what allows people in the West to privilege thinking about one set of evils, the evils towards Jews of Europe, vis-a-vis another set of evils, which they don't really think about, which is the evils towards peoples of the non-Western world, including Palestine, which is why, of course, Palestinians were made to pay the price, for the allegedly for the creation of the State of Israel, which in the West was always thought of primarily as making amends for the history of Western anti-Semitism, even though that making amends comes at the expense of the Palestinians in 1948. And it's not that people in the West didn't know that. They knew that, but they had a hierarchical sense of morality, that there was one set of victims who were more important fundamentally than another set of victims. And this hierarchy, I think, really continues to exist in Western academic thought and Western imagination all the way until today, which is why after World War II, why famous third world scholars and anti-colonial scholars, whether it was Aimé Césaire in 1955 or Edward Said, of course, closer to our own part of the world in 1978, when they wrote their devastating criticisms of Western thought, they pointed out the hypocrisy of what Césaire described as pseudo-humanism. This idea, Césaire said, you can't bifurcate. It's not right to bifurcate. You can't say you're concerned only with the Nazis and ignore the fact that you have Nazis in another name devastating peoples throughout the world, especially peoples of darker colors throughout the world. And so Césaire said this hypocrisy, this Western pseudo-humanism is unacceptable. And Said said the same thing in Orientalism, essentially saying that Orientalism is a way of essentially thinking about peoples in the non-Western world, particularly in the Islamic world, and especially about Palestine, as not only inferior, but as somehow outside of a moral framework. And so what happens in the West is that from the 1950s all the way until our own time, there's a consistent privileging of a narrative of one set of victims over the others. And so the Holocaust becomes the most important, and the Jewish victims of the Holocaust become the most important set of victims that are commemorated and thought about and written about in Western academia. And of course, it's important for no one to deny any of this. On the other hand, there is another set of victims who begin to become incorporated in the Western sort of hierarchy, which is past victims, slaves, Black people, people who were segregated, Native Americans, Indians, Aboriginals in Australia, and so on and so forth. But those people are seen as past victims. So they don't threaten again the sovereignty. So the primary victims are the Jews in World War II and of Western anti-Semitism. And then you have other victims who are considered to be past victims. And in this, there is still a refusal to deal with the Palestinians as people with history and people with humanity, because it disrupts this Western narrative of morality. This is what I want to say. And it comes to a fore after October 7th when Biden and virtually every single Western institution that I'm aware of, including my own, came out and condemned the Palestinians after October 7th, specifically, without mentioning anything about the history of Western colonialism, without mentioning Israeli colonialism, without mentioning the history of decades of oppression of the Palestinians, and without once, since October 7th, taking any position on the genocide that has unfolded since October 7th. And so when President Biden said that the events or the attacks of October 7th were as consequential as the Holocaust, this is his phrase, what he's basically saying is that the Palestinians essentially are new Nazis, and the Palestinians are going to be dealt with the way the Nazis were dealt with, essentially. So again, so denying the Palestinians and putting the Palestinians simply in a Western framework that has only three sort of positions: Western saviors, Jewish victims, and Nazis. This is the triad. And the Palestinians are only fit in Western academia as Nazi victims. This is at the level of officials I'm talking about. And so then this is what we see happening over and over again at an institutional level, at official level, at a government level. And so that's the great problem. The good news, insofar as there's any good news in this extraordinarily bleak time and moment that we're in, is that something is changing. Cracks are appearing. A younger generation of students and people who are even younger than college students are in fact being educated and educating themselves because they have access to social media. They are seeing what's happening in Palestine. They refuse this older narrative and this older hypocrisy. They refuse this hierarchy of victimization. They refuse this idea that only past victims should be commemorated. And they insist that present victims, i.e. Palestinians, have to also be acknowledged. And once you do that, and once you acknowledge Palestinian humanity and history, the entire Western edifice, academic edifice of morality and commemoration comes into question. And so that's where we are now. And I think there's something very interesting happening. And I'll end here by saying there is a generational change taking place that we see here in Western academia among our students overwhelmingly. There is a massive generational change taking place. I think it is a glimmer of hope in a time of extreme darkness. But it also tells us that we need to start rethinking the very notions of our global geographies. That the idea of a global North and a global South, while it makes sense, I think, economically, doesn't make sense anymore in terms of Palestine. Because what you see is there are countries in the global South, like India, which are very pro-Israel, and there are massive, massive youth demonstrations and mobilizations in the West, in the global North for Palestine. So something is shifting, something is changing. We need to rethink the geographies of global North and global South and start thinking about how this narrative that was set in stone after World War II at the expense of the Palestinians is, I think, finally beginning to weaken now in this moment. But it's weakening, of course, at a moment of genocide. And the question is, how will this genocide end? And what will there be after the genocide? And to what extent will this generation shift help move forward into the liberation of Palestine? So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ussama. Amahl, you want to pick up where Ussama left off?
Thank you so much. رمضان كريم، مساء الخير وصباح الخير للكل وين ما كان. And I want to say thank you so much for this invitation to speak to you all today from ACSS. It's an honor to join people and institutions that I've admired for many years, and also who are doing so much at this particular urgent time of genocide. And I actually was also going to, in some senses, start on the topic of land acknowledgements. I think I do this especially when I'm speaking like from my office. My university at Tufts University, my office at Tufts University is located on unceded Wampanoag and Massachusetts tribal territory. And I acknowledge that today because I think we can acknowledge the real continuities between these spaces of colonial dispossession and at a time when we see ferocious genocidal colonial violence having damaged and destroyed all universities in Gaza, we see arrest rates and threats at Palestinian universities in the West Bank. We see Palestinians expelled from their places at Israeli universities. So, and also at my own university and in so many universities in the United States, we can think about the long legacies of violence and dispossession. I actually don't know what this particular site was where I'm sitting, where I have the ease of making knowledge from this desk, what other kinds of indigenous knowledge were made at this desk or in this location, hundreds of years ago. But I do know that my university has not done enough to teach about the histories of dispossession and enslavement in which this territory, has been complicit and part of. But I do think, and I mention this partly because I think those legacies of dispossession are ongoing and active, also because I think that we can build power with Black and Indigenous people in the United States, as I've also seen these in the last months. Though I think, Ussama is correct that in some ways this is maybe not legible to the powers that be, but one of the most powerful gatherings that I have had the ability to go to this year was on the National Day of Mourning, which is actually known as Thanksgiving in the United States. And it's a gathering led by the United American Indians of New England on Plymouth Rock, which is one of those sites of, sort of first sites of colonization in the Americas, in North America. It's known for that. And, at that gathering, Palestine was, right there on the biggest banners. A Palestinian speaker was speaking about the ongoing genocide. People were holding posters talking about Leonard Pelletier, who is a political prisoner in the United States, and also about Palestinian prisoners. For me, this was, with individual faces, right, front and center. Walid Daqa and others, right? So this was a really powerful way for, sort of people power to come forward and think about reconstituting space, making connections, and so forth. And I also agree with everything that Ussama was saying. And I think that, it's really important to think about how universities, we tend to be these super, institutionally conservative spaces where, a land acknowledgement can be used as a gesture, as opposed to a robust way of acknowledging the ways in which dispossession and violence are ongoing here, and also connected to these other forms of colonial violence, which is all I'm trying to do. As I was working on this essay, my 7-year-old son came up to me and asked, "Mom, what does dignity mean?" And, thinking about this, I knew this was a question about the genocide, because we don't, always talk about dignity in my house. That's where the word is coming up. And, in the past, 15 years or so of having kids around the house, there've been some tough vocab words, but somehow this one struck closer to home and in ways almost hurt more. What does it mean for people to have dignity? What does this mean for this dignity be threatened? What does it mean for people to hold on to dignity in unimaginable circumstances? I think Palestinian journalists are some of the people we've seen demonstrating this inherent and beautiful sense of their own inner strength and self-worth. So Israel's genocidal violence over the last 6 months challenges our understandings also of what a news event is and what is structural violence, especially because this violence is part of these much longer structures of violence against Palestinians. The massive killing of journalists is part of a broader pattern of what Abdullah Muaswas, writing in the IPS blog, has called epistemicide. He describes this as the destruction of knowledge systems and the knowledge that they generate. And he draws on the work of Ramon Grossfockel, who writes about the connection between genocide and epistemicide in 4 European colonial genocides. Another important reminder of the colonial context of this war, as we've already heard about today. So I think this informs the ways in which the war on Palestinian journalism is entangled across time, space, and multiple forms of violence. And so I want to talk about the war on Palestinian journalism and the environments for restricting expression in which this war operates. In some of my other work, I've thought about environments for Palestinian expression as being constituted through laws, outright violence, and also cultural norms. And I see environments for expression across different Palestinian places as being connected to each other through Palestinian traditions of expression, but often in ways that are distinct due to the ways that Israeli settler colonialism has divided Palestinians up into different political spaces that each have their own specific threats to political expression. And we should also say that those different spaces also have their own allowances for and ways opening up and spaces that allow for political expression also. The case of Israel's war on Gaza accentuates many of these dynamics, and I want to just sort of talk about 5 of them. First, we see that symbolic and physical violence amplify each other. They are nearly inseparable. I think in some senses, I only hold apart the physical and symbolic violence to then show how they are ultimately knit together. Second, Israeli and US restrictions and rhetoric amplify each other, again, due to the ways that these legal systems are entangled and their cultural systems are imbricated with each other. And I'm not to say that this is an exclusive relationship between the United States and Israel. We can see how other states with their own specific ways in history, like Germany, France, and the UK, come into play too. but I do speak in some ways about the U.S. and Israel in part because the U.S. is, the territory that I am, know best, right? And well beyond the United States and Israel, I think it's important to acknowledge that we live in a world of information that are meaningfully global, like through social media and through other major media institutions, right? Third, at a time when the war on journalists is taking so many forms and is so vicious, it's dizzyingly, terrifyingly hard to identify the edges of this war. The effects of violence against and restrictions on journalists and communications are not limited to the communications realm. And then fourth, this intense violence of 2023 and 24 has a very long history that we need to acknowledge, related to Israeli blockade and impunity that Israel has given to those who have killed journalists in the past, and also in relationship to this rhetorical and military thing of the war on terror, a global structure. So I'll just start with some of the basic facts about the outright violence against journalists. And I've got a timer here that I'm going to glance at. Okay. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that this has been the deadliest period for journalists since CPJ began gathering data in 1992. Reporters Without Borders reports that at least 103 journalists have been killed by Israeli strikes in Gaza in the past 5 months, and at least 22 of those journalists were killed in the course of their work. Shuruk Assad, a member of the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate and a correspondent for Radio Monte Carlo, writes in The Nation, you can think of this as a genocide of journalists. And I should also acknowledge that there are different numbers that people are using for thinking about the numbers of journalists killed. And, I think, we just need to acknowledge those different methodologies and hold them up and, as really important figures that we need to grapple with. The gravity of them, all of them, is beyond terrifying. It's not only that journalists are being killed, but also that journalists witness each other being killed, that they see their families also being targeted. Perhaps we all know of the example of the Al Jazeera bureau chief Wael al-Dahdouh, who on October 25th lost his wife, son, and grandson as an Israeli strike hit the home where they were staying. And then, as though more and more horrors pile on December 25th, Samar Abu Daqqa and Wael al-Dahdouh himself were attacked by a drone strike while covering the aftermath of an Israeli strike on a UN school in Khan Yunis, an Israeli drone strike, of course. While Wael al-Dahdouh was able to make it to safety and medical care, Samar Abu Daqqa was unable to escape due to his injuries, and Israeli forces did not allow an ambulance to reach him for over 5 hours as he bled to death. And then we know on January 7th, Hamza al-Dahdouh, Wael's son, and also an Al Jazeera journalist, was killed alongside Mustafa Thuraya by an Israeli drone strike that targeted their car. They are not the only, this is not the only story. In November, Anas al-Sharif had received many threats from Israeli military officers instructing him to leave northern Gaza and cease his coverage. And shortly after that, an Israeli airstrike hit his home and killed his father, his 90-year-old father, in Jabalia. So, these terrifying numbers and forms of violence makes it almost hard to think about news as an event. Again, I think this is why thinking of this as a genocide against journalists is one way to wrap our minds around all of these killings together, right? It's also, I think the terrifying number of daily killings is also a mechanism for Israel to deny any intentionality for particular killings. They investigate. I opened the paper this morning to see that Israel has announced the results of their investigation of the killing of the 7 international aid workers earlier this week. But when will the thousands of other investigations start for the journalists and their fathers and children, the school teachers and their children, the medical workers, the professors, the grandparents? And sometimes it's possible to wonder whether journalists are being killed for their work or just simply killed as so many others are being killed in this time of genocide. And I'm sure that obviously there are journalists who are being killed who are not targeted exactly for their work, again, because of these huge numbers. But it's also really important to listen to what journalists themselves are saying about the risks that they face, the risks that they can feel sort of on their bodies on a day-to-day level. There's a really powerful podcast that Diana Buttu did with Hanan earlier this year. And he speaks about how after journalists lose their homes, they feel a special fear and concern about finding where they're going to stay next, because they worry that wherever they're staying could be a place that is targeted. They feel more comfortable sending their family members somewhere, but for themselves to find somewhere to stay presents an extra risk to whoever they're staying with. And I think we need to acknowledge the way in which that's kind of like the knowledge held in the body of the direct threat that they're facing. And I've written in the past about how sort of this sort of slow, fast dismemberment of Palestinian journalists' lives, which has happened before in the past, right? We've seen, for example, I'm thinking of the film by George Azar about Ra'ad Athamna, Gaza Fixer, journalists losing massive numbers of family members, or losing their colleagues in front of them. What does this mean for journalists, sort of ability to claim objectivity? In the past, I thought about that as kind of a threat to their own ability to claim objectivity. But I do think that's a terrain that's changing now. As we see, I think journalism as a whole shifting its claims around what it means to be outside and above a story, and also other ways we have of providing accountability. Checking the time again, I want to also hold up that another somewhat distinct element of this particular time is that journalists are facing imprisonment. The Reporters Without Borders recently reported that 38 Palestinians have been arrested since October 7th. 31 were still being held on January 9th. 19 are being held under administrative detention, which is how Israel holds people without charging them for periods of 6 months, renewable. It's really, and they also have a separate large category of people that they hold on trumped up charges of incitement. So it's really a puzzle to think about how they decide who to charge with incitement, often for really mundane things, very, very everyday statements that are not incitement to violence, and who they charge for administrative detention, for which they need no evidence at all. Meanwhile, as we know, and as we saw in the ICJ genocide case, Israeli leaders themselves are responsible for massive forms of incitement of violence against Palestinians. So this whole structure of using trumped up charges of incitement against journalists, holding others with no charges at all in the context of a genocidal war is something that I've yet to wrap my mind around. I also want to hold forward that most of those held under administrative detention and with charges of incitement are in the West Bank. But we also know that journalists are being held in especially horrendous and terrifying conditions, in Gaza, or if they have been detained from Gaza. And, that torture of those detainees is, horrific and needs to be accounted for. I think it's really important also to think about the historical precedent for these killings once again. So thinking about how CPJ, about 1 year after Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by Israeli forces, by an Israeli sniper in Jenin, the Committee to Protect Journalists issued a report that said that in the 22 years, like from 2000 to 2022, Israel had killed 20 journalists, and no one had been held accountable for any of those deaths, right? This creates an atmosphere of impunity that allows for more and more killings to take place. The paths to these killings have been paved by decades of past killings of journalists. The blockade, Israel's blockade itself, prepares the world for this kind of death, as well as Palestinians in Gaza are sealed away, expected by the world to be barely surviving, less a part of the everyday fabric of Palestinian and global cultural exchanges because they cannot come and go. And also we know that it puts everybody in Gaza at additional risk. If Israel had to account for the fact that they might be hitting, foreign journalists working for, foreign news organizations, it would certainly change their calculations on how they're using certain forms of violence. We know now that journalists, foreign correspondent journalists, are entering Gaza only with the Israeli army. Another important part of the story here is to think about communications outages. There have been major outages of internet connectivity in every, consistently throughout this war. And we've also seen, for example, 2 Jawal workers trying to repair that telecommunications system killed by an Israeli missile targeting their car on January 13th while they were trying to repair telecommunications infrastructure. And this is an example of how the war on journalists impacts, is not only a war on journalists, right? Because the outages of communication impact, as we know, emergency services for healthcare. Obviously, they impact every person who wants to, in Gaza, who wants to reach somebody outside of Gaza, and every person outside of Gaza who wants to reach someone inside Gaza. So this war on journalists has these really, really broad impacts, and it makes it hard sometimes to even identify the logics of this violence, but it's work that we have to do. We see also attacks on journalists now and then, as we've seen the new Israeli law allowing Israel to close foreign press offices for periods of 45 days renewably if the prime minister deems them to undermine national security, followed by a tweet by Netanyahu, quote, the terrorist channel Al Jazeera will no longer broadcast from Israel, right? So in addition to a language of security, we get his extra allegation and incitement using the word terrorism. And it's important, I think, to recognize that accusations against Al Jazeera and violence against Al Jazeera as an institution fall into a pattern of, a global war on terror, as this discursive and military formation that has always targeted Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera hit by a U.S. missile in Kabul in November 2001, hit by a U.S. missile in Baghdad, killing journalist Tariq Ayoub in 2003, and Al Jazeera journalist Sami al-Hajj held for over 6 years at Guantanamo, right? So Netanyahu's logic of attacking Al Jazeera falls right into that pattern all too seamlessly. Also, we can put it in the pattern of the October 2021 declaration of 6 Palestinian organizations as terrorist groups. I had a few more things here about actually like Biden himself inciting against or, casting doubts on Palestinians as possible knowledge producers when he said in October 25th that he had no confidence in the Gazan Ministry of Health numbers, sort of just, suggesting that all Palestinians are lying right in the middle of a genocide, or that Palestinian authorities are lying right in the middle of a genocide. We're not able to keep track of every single death. He walked that back, but I mean, this is an extraordinary disrespect for the work that's being going on to document these crimes. But to conclude, I just want to return to the theme of dignity. I think when we think of the dignity of journalists, we can think about that individual dignity. And I'll just say that, for 20 years, as I've been writing and thinking about journalism, I would often get this question like, oh, you're a woman writing about journalism. Could you tell us something about gender in journalism? And I've kind of rejected those questions for all kinds of reasons, because they tend to just sort of perpetuate and fall into these really simplistic US-based discussions about gender in the Arab world. But I do want to say that right now, as we see Palestinian journalists as full people, as women and men whose bravery, precision, tenderness, and strength all defy stereotypes of what in the United States, of what men and women, Arab men and women are expected to be. I think that's a really powerful and beautiful thing. And I think that that's not only defying US stereotypes, but we see how it's also providing public models of Palestinian womanhood and manhood for new generations to aspire to. I think it's important to recognize how this world of Palestinian journalism has been supported and cultivated by Palestinian universities and Palestinian media institutions that have supported these journalists in flourishing, and also how, as we've seen, when one journalist needs to step back, there are younger generations that are able to step forward, because we see journalists mentoring each other, honoring each other like brothers, sisters, and friends. And so, I just want to end with that note of honoring all of that knowledge work that we know will provide us a record that we will need to continue the struggle for Palestinian liberation and safety for Palestinians in the months and years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Amahl. We move now to Hanan. Hanan,
Yes, thank you, Dina. Thank you, Satani and the Arab Council for this evening, and for actually, I listened and attended very carefully the last 3 sessions. So the Arab Council always gives us the possibility of actually, or the space and the time to think together. And I would like to start by actually highlighting the difference in space from which we're speaking. Ussama and Amahl are speaking from a very different space from where I am right now. I'm speaking from Cairo, from my residence here in Du'i, but more so as a professor, associate professor of anthropology at the American University in Cairo. And what I would like to do is to take us through what would the genocide, and it's not that we do not know how to speak the genocide, we're actually witnessing it, we're seeing it. But when did it actually start? And it's not the question of October 7, which takes us to the very important part of, yes, there are 6 months, we're marking 6 months into the whole story of genocidal erasure of a whole people, but that erasure has been taking place for more than 100 years. What we are witnessing right now is a very serious intensification of that, with a bafflement at a certain silence, at a certain negation and erasure that actually is happening, although we are seeing it day in, day out. And what I want to use this for is to be able to think through precisely the 2 titles in the 2 terms in the title of our session, the academy and criticality, or critically. What's the academy? A year ago, we had I'm also involved, I have to say, as a privilege with the Arab Council through the new generation of social scientist fellow. And a year ago, we had a session where we're trying to think through what's actually the academy for new generation. And does it hold? And what was very clear that through that conversation that we've had, and also through the number of reports that the Arab Council Observatory had produced, is that the academy has very different meanings. That whatever we believe to be participating in no longer holds for a younger generation that has very different aspirations, very different understandings, very different disenchantments with the world that they can no longer actually feel attached to by any stretch of the imagination. A year later, October 7th happened, and in between hundreds of people detained, massacred. But October 7th happened, and genocide, quote unquote, starts taking place as a continuation of a very long process, as I said. That puts an incredible onus on the academy actually to have to explain itself to that generation and to ourselves. What on earth are we doing? What is it that we are involved in? How can I go into the classroom and explain to my students anything about decolonial thinking or criticality at the same moment that they are seeing that actually none of those things make sense? When the ICG ruling came out and everybody was saying, hey, maybe, but of course. And I mean, one of my students, and actually lots of them, said, an Arabic phrasing, Billah washrab mayitha, soak it in water and drink it. It doesn't mean anything in terms of people's livelihoods, which puts the question on what is it actually the academy is contributing to in this conversation, at the forefront of our conversation. And here the classroom for me, as well as the larger context in which the classroom is situated, namely the university, as only 2 sides to which we can think that question. And for me, one of the issues is how precisely what Amahl was talking about, the proliferation of the citizen journalism, the social media, the TikTok images that populated my classroom before even anybody could speak anything about what is going on. So there is a certain imagination and a certain flow and a certain intensity of movement, of solidarity that somehow took everybody by the storm in the classroom before anything else, and on campuses before the university administrators were even willing to take stock and speak and think with it in terms of how. And the question was, why is it? Why and how do we explain that? And is it a question of the younger generation who felt disillusioned by the Arab Springs in that sense, again speaking from the Arab world, or that there is something more about Palestine that they grew up with as part of an imaginary of liberation, without which No liberation can actually have any certain sensibility, although they did not live that history. They were not part of that history, but they learned it. And they heard about it, and they were exposed to it in all sorts of ways. And that also brings in the question when students come to the classroom and say, okay, how is it that South Africa is the only country that, not the only, but the main country that actually brought the rulings against the ICG? And part of the question is, what kind of colonial histories and particular experiences of colonialism and settler colonialism in specific do we need to actually reiterate in our classrooms all the time in order to be able to see that kind of link and see the link of why certain spaces have become very important in that kind of engagement, or trying to fathom if there is any fathoming, or if there is any ability to make sense of it at all. The other layer to this is not only that the digital citizen journalism has moved into all sorts of spaces, making precisely the intensity and the different layers of the violence that is taking place visible to our ears and eyes all the time, because beside watching, we can actually hear. We can hear the drones that are non-stop floating and flying over certain places. But it also brings in another layer, and that's a continuation of a conversation that we could have from the very first intervention by Ussama. It's not only that the liberal claims of the Western Academy and the celebration of a distant past, the commemoration is very much part of the story, but because it is a really brutal, mad world that we are living through. And people can think of Palestine through their own displacements and killings and repressions day in and day out. Indeed, we are not living the intensification of power cuts, hunger, starvation, bombing, drones, etc., etc. But at the same time, people have been displaced, whether in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Jordan, in Palestine, in South Africa. They have been killed, they have been detained, they have been starved, they cannot make their funding. And in that sense, what Achille Mbembe was talking about in brutalism, that the world has reached a level of brutality with which we have to be able to contend if there is any desire for us to talk about the possibility and a potential of the future, of which I'm a big believer that definitely there is a certain potential that has to come out of this moment. But why Palestine is so present and so threatening at the same time? Precisely because it is the metonym. It is what maybe we have talked about earlier, and Satine in her introduction said the litmus test, the paradigm, etc., etc. But on the other hand, it is something in which hundreds and thousands of millions of people who are still alive on this globe can actually partake in that experience. I have been detained, I have been dispossessed, I have been, and the question moves on, which brings in the complicity, not only at the level of the past of colonialism, but at the present of continuous coloniality, very much part of the story of why Palestine is critical for us to think with whichever nature of the classroom that we are involved in. And that also brings in the question of how is it that the people with whom we can think right now, or at least for me in my teaching at the moment when we are all completely stunned by the madness, which has no words to describe it, are figures that we used to teach to talk about the Algerian. Fanon was the first person, October 7th, October 8th or 9th and 10th, when we went back to the classroom trying to answer a question of how on earth can we actually explain that? And by that time, everybody was still living with a certain expectation of a temporality that we're talking about maximum 2 weeks. Today, 6 weeks. 6 months, sorry. Yesterday, I was saying the same thing in my class, and I had the slip of the tongue, which is very sad, but very true. I said 6 years, which is not an impossibility, by the way. It's not, because even if we can imagine that the ceasefire happens tomorrow, the genocide has been going on for longer than 6 months and will continue after the genocide. What did Fanon tell us about that? What did Fanon tell us about the intellectual at the moment of coloniality? For a colonized people, that's registry of the earth on violence, concerning violence. For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. Any report that has been coming recently from Palestine, and by Palestine, by the way, I do not mean only Gaza. I mean Palestine, the whole of Palestine, being able to still iterate Palestine and Palestine without having to fall into the trap of the apartheid logic of Gaza, West Bank, 67, the Arab 48, is part of our struggle to insist, no, it is Palestine. It cannot be apartheid in that logic that it has been on the table. And the question here is the most concrete and foremost is the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. 70% of agricultural land already is gone. And we'd have no idea what the bombing actually could have produced in terms of, quote unquote, the famous phrasing that the world has been living with, climate change. I mean, sometimes it's stunning that all the things that we celebrated are becoming so empty. Climate change when we are witnessing erasure, complete erasure. Democracy, when we're witnessing complete oppression. Potentialities of decolonization, when the colonial has been in our face so hard that we cannot even get out of it. What does the intellectual do? All that the native has seen in this country is that they can freely arrest him, beat him, starve him. And no professor of ethics, no priest has ever come to be beaten in his place, nor to share their bread with him. As far as the native is concerned, morality is very concrete. There are no hypocrisy, dual standards, no nothing. It's very concrete. It is to silence the settler's defiance, to break his flaunting violence in a world, to put him out of the picture. I mean, whatever we want to say, it is very important to bring back the story precisely, as Ussama was saying, to where we can start thinking. Settler colonialism, that's at the heart of the question. That's at the heart of the dispossession that we are seeing, that our classrooms need to be able to actually think again with Palestine along all the different layers of dispossession that has been taking place is very important. The other part, which I think is equally important in that sense of why Palestine and how Palestine, because for it's not simply a question of how, but the how. Of the why, but the how equally important. The how of trying to actually move through the paradigm and to the paradigm of Palestine as a paradigm or as a litmus test, to actually remember something very important, that paradigm itself rests on a long history of attempts to compartmentalize the histories of the world into, whether geographically, global south and north, which had a certain cachet at a particular moment in time, but I don't think we can still reproduce them as if they have a possibility of continuing without any questioning to what they actually entail. Second, the coloniality, decoloniality layer, that we need to actually re-look at it and precisely ask what Amahl and Ussama, for instance, and the last 3 sessions have been talking about. Why has there been such a silence? Such a silence, and being able or unable to actually to speak a language that will be understood, will be fathomable to people who actually have lost the ability that anybody and anywhere can be a point of contention, and to look at the coloniality precisely in its neoliberal form of our contemporary institutions of higher learning, our universities. And why the university, precisely for the younger generation, looked at the academy as a very important side of reproducing knowledge, but also relations of power, feel very troubled by it, because it is premised literally on a very colonial neoliberal paradigm and logic that refuses to budge even in the face of something as terrifyingly horrific as what is happening in a place like Egypt, literally next door. And how do we do that in a place also within a nation and a state and a nation that yesterday arrested 10 people at the steps of the journalism journalism syndicate because of a protest in solidarity with Palestine? 10 people. Why is Palestine so threatening? That's the question, I think. And it is so threatening not only because it is that part which we have to contend with in terms of the coloniality of relationships that continue actually to constitute our present, but also because the liberation of Palestine, or trying to think about it otherwise, will entail that those current regimes in the region and otherwise will not be able to sustain themselves. Because if you actually detain 10 people today, in addition to 150 who were detained the first week after the protests were called in the central square of Egypt, Tahrir Square, then the question poses itself: why is it that solidarity with Palestine is so threatening, and threatening to whom? Why is it that the university is willing to say, okay, we will support your protest, we will support teach-ins, as long as they are defined within a very particular spectrum or a paradigm of knowledge that will not challenge the very existence of the university? Why is it then that students in our classroom and in these institutions that are bound by larger political constellations that deem it unacceptable and threatening to talk Palestine, at the same time want to appear as liberal, as open-minded, as politically correct, and hence announce solidarity with Palestine, but within the parameters that are only acceptable to those who are comfortable in their position? Why is it that a suhoor can be held with people who are on boycott lists? Why is it that the university systematically is refusing actually to take a step that makes a conversation about Palestine on campus, an invitation to displaced scholars, a very different kind of relationship, literally a political relationship, rather than try to maintain the university and the academy as a neutral, apolitical entity, and hence it lost its ability to have any meaning to anybody outside of our very nice, comforting cohort to each other. And that takes me to the last point, one conclusion that I want to make. The beyond of the university, which I think is equally important to our thinking, not only about critically engaging with the question of Palestine, but critically engaging of what constitutes the academy, and why are institutions that are already defined within the framework of higher learning as academic incapable of doing their job? What does it need to be on that edge or beyond the academy or outside the academy allow? And by here, I mean outside the universities or recognized research institutions that are given the credibility of producing the knowledge. It's precisely from those sites there is a possibility of questioning the very logic and paradigm on which that knowledge production can proceed. What is academy? How do we want to move ahead without having to succumb to what, again, without me reading, so that not to save time, the intellectual that already has been within the colonial system and liberal in his or her own thinking to the extent that they are unwilling to call on the colonial settler mentality that is out there, to call on the sovereign abuse of the rights, to call on the brutality of the regimes that are out there. Outside of the academy, that is happening with a certain degree of thinking critically, by literally refusing to accept a rule of the game that the academy has put to be recognized as an academic, that your writing will be recognized as an academic. I know I'm going very fast for the translators, but I'm sorry. And that's the whole point. How do you play by different rules of academic production to the extent that the term academic itself will be able to entertain its own weaknesses, its own inability to deal with the moment that actually brutality has spoken in its face and said, I am here and you will not be able to dislodge. That's what the genocide in the last 6 months has been doing. It is telling all of us, I am here and you will not be able to dislodge me. So can we still be willing to, as universities have done, and we were told that point blank, continue as business as usual, be silent, speak only within certain frames that are acceptable or allowable, or precisely also, and that's where I want to make the last point, people have made moves to create linkages and connections outside of the frames that have been established to us by the academy and by the institutions in which we're working. And I think that's the lead for us to think otherwise and to think about how a different way of the past students are desiring to learn about those kinds of histories that are there, but outside already of frameworks that determine how that history is going to be narrated to them. They are desiring to understand what is happening right now. And hence they went to institutions or initiatives that are able to use all sorts of experimental understandings about critique, about writing, about knowledge. And there they found the space to be able to create different kinds of solidarities and imagine how do we move in the moment, for instance, and one very concretely said, when the ISSG doesn't mean anything to us anymore. How do we move? How do we build on that? What are the possibilities that are left to us in order to be able to challenge something that is as brutal as maddening? And maddening, I mean, right? It's as mad what is going on to take it a step further. And that's the kind of relationship between, for instance, academics and journalists. I mean, what is happening for the last 2 weeks is precisely what kind of alliances can happen there, what kind of solidarities and work that builds on the knowledges that are gained here that can inform the theorizing that is taking place within the universities. And here the theorizing needs actually to think about itself not necessarily as an abstract umbrella, but theorizing actually from the site, from the place where blood is spilled. And I want to end with something. It might be a very banal reading, but I think it tells the story where, as an anthropologist, I feel ethnography we've all have been unable to deal with it. It's to get us to understand genocide not from the perspective of the West, and to try to figure out why have they been in such a paradoxical situation. I totally recognize the importance of that conversation. But what does it mean? Not to think of Palestine as a paradigm, as I was saying, or to think about it as a metonym, as I was also saying, or a litmus test, but as something that is lived. And it is lived through, and if I may, I'm going to read that in Arabic, a very dear friend who's a journalist, Amahl in Gaza, who had been displaced from the north, and he's talking about his relationship to sand and dust. So let me read that, and that's where I want to close, because we have to remember that academic language, no matter how fancy we are, we have very certain limits, and our limits are our inability to be able to actually understand and to sense and to feel and to be affected and to affect living in the midst of total destruction. Here you go. سلم الرئيس. أنا والرمال في علاقة جديدة متلاصقة. زمان يعني قبل 6 شهور كانت علاقتي بالرمل قائمة على شاطئ البحر فقط. هناك بمشي على الرمل حافي القدمين، بقعد على الرمل عادي، بلعب بالرمل أحيانا، لا بتذمر ولا بتضايق. هناك على الشاطئ العلاقة بين الجسد الآدمي والرمل طبيعية. لكن بمجرد ما أروح على البيت وبظن مثل غالبية البشر العلاقة بتتحول وتتبدل وتنتقل من مرحلة التخلص من أي رملة عالقة أو ملتزقة بجسدي، وأبتعد عن أي منطقة رملية لدرجة أنني أفضل السير على الشوارع الأسفلتية عن الشوارع الرملية الترابية. هكذا كانت العلاقة بيني وبين الرمال والأتربة. في المنزل كنا وكتير زينا نكنس ونمسح وننظف الغبار والأتربة والرمال عن بلاط أرضية المنزل والعفش. يجب أن يكون منزلنا نظيف ومرتب. هكذا أيضا بنيت العلاقة بيننا وبين الرمال كعلاقة طبيعية. لكن الحال تبدل وتغير والعلاقة انقلبت منذ 6 أشهر تقريبا. بعد اضطرارنا للنزوح من المنزل، البعض حالفوا الحظ باللجوء لمنزل أقارب أو استئجار منزل أو غرفة أو حاصل صغير. لكن الغالبية منا لجأ إلى خيمة في الشارع أو على الرصيف أو في أراضي فارغة، والبعض على شاطئ البحر مكان العلاقة الطبيعية مع الرمال. في الخيام توجب علينا النوم على الأرض دون فراش أحيانا، وأحيانا أخرى على فراش خفيف فوق الرمال، لكن اختلطت أجسادنا بالرمال والأتربة طول اليوم، أثناء الجلوس، أثناء الطبخ وتناول الطعام، وحتى أثناء النوم. شخصيا لم أتذمر كثيرا في البداية، كنت أنتقل من مكان إلى مكان بحكم العمل، من خيمة إلى خيمة، حتى بدأت أحتاز لبس الشبشب بدل الجزمة أو البوت الرياضي. أصبح الشبشب أقرب وأنسب إلى طبيعة العلاقة الجديدة مع الرمال، بالإضافة أصبح أسهل في التعامل. مؤخرا تغلغلت الرمال بين خيوط وأنسجة البطاريات الشتوية والتصقت بها. أصبحت أحاول تنظيفها من خلال نفضها مرارا وتكرارا وبقوة، ولكن هيهات أن تنظف بسهولة ودقة. أعيد استخدامها ليلا فأجد الرمال ملتصقة بجميع أنحاء جسدي، من أصابع قدمي وحتى شعر رأسي. أصبحت أتذمر من تلك الحالة، حتى بدأت أقتنع مجبرا على تغير تلك العلاقة بين جسدي والرمال لتصبح علاقة متلاصقة طول اليوم وأكثر طبيعية خلال أدق تفاصيل اليوم. هذا ما فعلته الحرب. الرملة ده أقل حاجة، بس let's actually find a way in all our endeavors to step down from the universal abstract to the lived, sensory, horrifying experience and think about our relationship to science. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanan, and thanks to all of you. I am going to begin by taking questions, and then perhaps we can all have a conversation if there are not enough questions, but I already have a couple of questions coming in. Let me see. How do I get to them, Ilyas, all the way up to the panel, to the...
Dr. Dina, there's a question in the chat, if it's easier to get there, from Fatima.
Yes, and it's a question to all of them, but I'm trying to get to it, if you will give me a minute. So Fatima Radhoni from Tunisia asks to all of you, given the colonial context of the war on Gaza, in a context where Palestinians are entangled in different horrendous types of atrocities and different sides, such as epistemicide, do you think that the Israeli colonial project is much more focused on spatiocides and the mapping of new geography? Is it the land which matters most?
I can start, and then Amahl and Ussama, if I may. I think the land is very important, but I would add to the land is the question of time. Because here we're talking about the colonization of time equal to the colonization of land, Fatima. And by that I mean it's not only, or Israeli colonial project is not only premised on creating a new logic of geography, a new relationship of like destroying the certain relationships that have been in existence, or an attempt also to make their way at the present moment, despite all the violence that is taking place. But it is equally, and we can see that the geographical spatial aspect precisely in the logic of how we, in our language, have accepted the language of 3 different spaces: Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and 48. And part of the problem precisely is to reduce that logic, that spatialization, and second, to think about the other very important layer to the colonization of space, which is the colonization of time. The colonization of time in terms of very particular narratives of the past that become the only legitimate narratives that are there to be told about the past and what happened. The colonization of memory, but also the colonization of the rhythm of the everyday. One of the most important things, or one of the most horrific deep-rooted things about either this since October 7th, the attacks on Gaza and in the West Bank, is the timing of them. There is a very interesting rhythms to bombing that we need to pay attention to. It's since Ramadan, it's during iftar time or during suhar time, it's during nighttime, to the extent that the idea of having this naturalized, normalized day and night is completely ruptured. So there is normalcy, no normalcy to an everyday in that sense that has any resemblance to a particular understanding of how days and nights proceed to each other. So I would argue besides space, time is very important in this.
Amahl?
Yeah, I definitely agree that thinking about land and space is really crucial right now as we look at the way in which Israel is trying to divide Gaza into two, obviously, using space, really weaponizing space, to keep people from, food and drink, ruining the environment in so many different ways, including, threats to the water table and the aquifer, and agricultural land, as Hanan spoke about. Also, I think it's just important. I'm really appreciating the Hanan's focus also on fighting against this fragmentation of Palestinians between Gaza and the West Bank and 48, and also the Shatat. And I think that so it's also important to mention that at least 16 rural communities in the West Bank have been dispossessed of their lands and communities at this time. So we see an ongoing Nakba of dispossession across these different spaces. Land is absolutely central. Thank you.
Ussama?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what everyone just said, with what Hanan and Amahl just said, and there's really not much to add except to say that the logic of any settler colonial sort of project is the elimination of the native and the conquest of land. And we see that the difference between the Israeli settler colonial project and every other one is that the Israelis haven't succeeded in terms of eliminating the natives, which is why what you see happening now is happening now with the intensity that is happening now, precisely because there are so many Palestinians who remain, 50% of the population inside of historic Palestine, let alone all the refugees outside and the people outside.
Thank you all. There's a question for you, Ussama. What can threaten the remaining sovereignty of Arab states? How does the shifting global north and south affect them? And are they out of the framework? What does that mean? I mean, there's multiple questions on the global, on sovereignty and the shifting global north-south axis. Do you want to take this up?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question was, Dina. If the question is the Arab states, is that the question?
Yeah, let's stick to the first question. What can threaten the remaining sovereignty of the Arab states, remaining being keyword?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, the Arab states, as everyone knows, the Arab states, have been absolutely scandalous in what is going on now. And it's actually interesting. I would have liked to have learned what Arab academia is like, or what's left of Arab academia in the Arab world. What's the position? I heard from Hanan, of course, in terms of what's going on at AUC. What about other universities in Egypt? What about in Tunis? What about in Algeria, Morocco, so on and so forth? But the Arab states don't represent. I mean, the interesting moment that we're in now is that the Arab states are part of the problem. I mean, it's very clear. The Arab states have lined up with the United States. They've lined up, in essence, as far as I can tell, with have turned a blind eye to what Israel, or are complicit in cases of the UAE, for example, absolutely complicit with what is going on with Gaza, with the destruction of the Palestinians. And so the question for me is there's a global, as I said, the global north, global south, that geography is shifting. There's clearly a huge amount of Arab popular sort of solidarity and empathy and identification as Arabs and as Muslims with Palestine and with what's going on in Palestine. The Arab states are they've been a facade of Western hegemony for decades and decades, first British, today American, and they have their own internal logic. So I don't know what the question is exactly, but I put zero faith in Arab states right now in their current sort of formulation, frankly. It's absolutely scandalous.
Thank you. Well, we have a question from Mexico, from Nafret from Mexico. The intent of Israel, and I think, Amahl, this might be specifically directed to you, but it could be all of you might be able to answer it. The intent of Israel is to silence and erase Palestinian narrative, has always been there. Why now this Orientalist propaganda is not working anymore? I mean, besides the Palestinian journalists doing great work, is there something about the Palestinian experience that resonates among colonized populations? And I guess also this addresses both you and Hanan, Ussama, as well. But you want to pick it up, Amahl?
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I think that this is, why is the Orientalist propaganda not working anymore? I think it's a lot of things. I think that the boycott movement, for example, has raised the profile of Israeli apartheid and Israeli settler colonialism for more and more people, and created kind of the possibility of certain kinds of grassroots networks. We see the rise in the United States of support in the labor movement for Palestinians, which is quite new, and we've seen over the last several years also the connections between the Black Lives Matter movement and Palestinian rights movement, as well as between the Standing Rock and indigenous rights movements and the Palestine movement. So I think that this is and again, I recognize that I'm speaking from a very United States perspective and experience, which is the one I know best. But, I think that all of those movements has helped for Palestinian rights to come to the fore. I think we've seen major, and very, 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 very belated major human rights reports on Israeli apartheid that create this kind of public record. Of course, we know that the reports of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are building on the reports of B'Tselem, which was building on the decades of work by Al-Haq, as well as decades of their own work. But the point is, we see this infrastructure of knowledge and this record that's being created that can be drawn on more and more. And Israel, of course, has been having these horrific wars on Gaza over the last, since 2008-9, right? And so we've seen this violence repeated over and over again. And I mean, I've been talking to my students, about, memories of being in the streets in 2008-9, which was a winter war, right? You know what I mean? So, I mean, I think that it's been a movement that's been growing for lots of different reasons. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to?
Can I jump in on this?
Yes, Ussama.
Yeah, I think the essence of Orientalism is the refusal to allow people in the non-West to represent themselves. And I think what you see now globally, it's not just in America, and it's not just solidarity in America, as Amahl was correctly saying. Of course, I agree with what you said, but it's also, this is a global phenomenon. I mean, Palestinians and young people and people who identify with Palestine overwhelmingly around the world are able to articulate a very basic human position, which is that justice and equality. It's not very complicated. And so for that reason, I think people around the world identify. And there are many, remember, there are many more, ultimately, many more Palestinians, many more Muslims, many more Arabs, many more people of conscience around the world, actually, who today identify with Palestine than there ever were in the past. And that's all going in a direction, I think, that is challenging and undermining the Israeli narrative. And the last thing I'll say is that in the West, and maybe Hanan in Egypt is a different story, I don't know, but in the West, in the United States, what I found most interesting is the Zionist argument. No longer, they don't even pretend to argue with us anymore. They don't actually present ethical or intellectual arguments anymore. All they do is accuse everybody of anti-Semitism, 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 as a way of shutting down debate. And as Ephra Powell put it, going after DEI because DEI has opened up some space. So my point is that there's no intellectual argument anymore. There's no ethical argument for Zionism. What there is an ethical argument for Palestine and Palestinian liberation and human liberation and the connection between the two. So that's the reason why the Zionist narrative has collapsed. But there's a difference between the narrative collapsing and the huge amount of investment they've made in lobbying for decades and decades, which we're going to live with for still a long time to come.
If I may add to Ussama very quickly, totally I agree with Ussama and Amahl, and I think part of that I wouldn't go that far as saying the Orientalist propaganda is not working, because it's still working for some, and it is doing some work that has an effect that is very important. It is dwindling, and it is we're seeing its limits, precisely as Ussama was saying, and part of that is that what is happening is Palestine has been happening the world over, in all sorts of different manifestations and in parcels, in bits and pieces. What we have here is a concentration of brutality and madness. And that's why part of what it's happening in terms of the relationship between the academy and criticality, or the academy is outside, is to literally bring that to the fore, which is one of the reasons why Palestine is so threatening, because those connections, like when Marx was speaking about commodities, the relationship is being revealed in this utter and sheer brutality and madness that is happening. The relationship of complete oppression and dispossession of hordes and hordes of people that has been going on for years, that who have also been talked about as the native, as the rotten, as the wretched, and that kind of celebration. The Arab states totally complicit in that story and totally frightened by the possibilities of what Palestine will bring. And the only thing I will draw our attention to as speakers is what is happening in Jordan, Amman, for the last 5 days. The kind of marches and protesters, and precisely by whom? Precisely by young generation who are refusing to accept the terms that have been put on the table as the only way through which we can think about liberation or a different possibility, or the terms of decolonial critique that has also populated our shelves for the last decade and a half. Both of those, I think, have been emptied of their meaning in the moment that we're facing this particular violence, which is not unprecedented, but it's the intensification and the concentration.
I have one more question that I can see. This is from Fuad Halbouni, or Halbouni, I can't tell لأنه بالإنجليزي. As Arab academics, every time we get to talk, we are reminded by other European or American academics that we are reverting to a crude nationalism or romanticization of the roots of our homeland. How can we speak about place that is inhabited and not just a space that is somehow is more vacant in its description, a place as a living and breathing space? This is something I think Hanan alluded to, and perhaps you'd like to all of you to comment on this.
Fuad, I know Anat Halbouni, so I know
yes.
with us. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Dina. And it raises the question, Fuad, to what extent is the nation state part of the key categories that we need to contend with at this very particular moment, and to imagine of a living, breathing space outside of the very racialization and oppression and coloniality of the nation state that has presented itself to us for the last 2 centuries. And I think part of the threat of Palestine and part of the emptiness of the 2-state solution. I mean, that's precisely part of the point, is that to what extent can you talk about a state when a state is already emptied out of its meaning, not only as a PA or as a 2-state solution that is imagined for Palestine, but as a lived reality that we are all living with, not only in the region, but I would extend this much, much broader than the region. And that's where certain alliances also with Latin America and other places in Africa become very important in trying precisely to think, not by adding simply the post, like the post-humor or the post-nation or the post-colonial, that the era of post, I think we have outlived the khalas, but to actually think about what is it about a different kind of political imagery can we think about and live with that already we have been living with, but we do not find the language to it.
Does anybody else want to respond?
Well, I'll just say that I was very, very moved by Hanan. The writing about the sand is really, really, really powerful, and I think it's exactly that kind of an example of that. You know, dealing with place and its materiality, the lived experience, thinking about inhabiting space over time. So I'm really going to carry that with me. I'm so appreciative of that. I think perhaps one thing that Palestine Studies offers to you know, get beyond thinking about the nation state is really like thinking with refugees, and thinking with refugees because so much, I mean, because so many refugees and also so much scholarship on refugees now is able to think about the ways in which refugees have multiple connections to place that are completely, that would be, you know, flattened and not honored by sort of through these state nationalist narratives. Not to mention that obviously, you know, sort of the hegemonic versions of the Palestinian national movement have not done enough to, you know, hold up the experiences and claims of refugees. I mean, setting that to the side, but thinking about the ways in which refugee studies, it's important, but I think refugee studies goes even further than that to think about how refugees are importantly connected to camps and also to places of origin and also to other places that they've inhabited and moved through, and so forth. So I think we have that to offer, not only sort of to broader thinking about Palestine, but, you know, to thinking about refugee studies in general. And I think that, you know, there's some wonderful, wonderful scholarship on camps that, you know, is, you know, to be affectionate without being romanticizing, you know, and to honor place without being sort of nostalgic, or crudely nationalist, to recognize. And I think also we, you know, refugee camps are great places for thinking about like infrastructure and infrastructure failures or lacks, right? So thinking about place in terms of experience, but also thinking about it in terms of things like infrastructure that get us into sort of both the everyday of services as well as, you know, things about like state services or, you know, sort of the materiality of those kinds of semi-public spaces and also semi-hidden networks of infrastructure. So, yeah, I definitely think that refugee camps can be one focus of that work. And I say that as, you know, somebody who is trying to do some of that work myself. Yeah.
Ussama, is there something you want to add?
Not really. I agree with what was
Oh,
said.
yeah.
So good.
So we have another question from Nada Sayed. Apart from the broader impacts of bombings across Gaza, could we specifically address the targeting of schools and universities as a critical threat to the academic future of Palestine? I'm interested in hearing your thoughts and insights on this matter.
I mean, we're talking about the obliteration of every single institution in Gaza. I mean, this is clearly scholasticide, and the impacts and the effects are going to be, you know, for generations to come. I mean, just like everything else that's happening in Gaza, let alone what's happening in the West Bank. But we're talking about obliteration. So I don't know, you know, I'm not qualified to talk about what's going to happen in the future in terms of the effects of this. But clearly, this is a systematic Israeli campaign of obliteration of all aspects of Palestinian society. So even when the ceasefire comes, how is this going to be reconstructed? And how is this all going to be redone? I mean, that's a question for, I'm sure there are better qualified people to think about, but clearly this is an aspect of obliteration, and the silence of Western academia is even more scandalous, precisely because of this deliberate obliteration of universities. And not a single university, to my knowledge, anywhere in the West has said a word about this yet. And that to me is one of the great scandals.
Anybody? Yes, Hanan.
Yeah, and I think part of that is not only that we're losing key sites of knowledge production and the possibilities for people. I mean, Ussama said it brilliantly. I'm not going to add, but there is another dimension to that is very important, are the archives and archival collections and holdings that were in these places that are completely gone. Who and how do we actually remake those archival collections and those books that are very rare because they were also produced under conditions of occupation? So the flexibility of moving things in and out are not always there. So when we talk about something that is destroyed and gone, it is destroyed and gone with very little copies outside of it. So the problem is really very serious and very dramatic, and that raises for us, I think, in that sense, the other two questions. What kind of oppression and limitations or obstructions have been in the process as a colonized space of knowledge production has been going on for years, that we need to take stock of that and recognize it and think about what does it mean for people to be able to continue doing what they were doing when they were constantly under the threat of detention or being murdered, or that they cannot say what they want to say. And it's I mean, to give you one concrete example, the new generation scholars, the program that we run with the Arab Council, is like what, from Palestine we had 10 people, when at least 2 of those have been already arrested and detained. That tells you something about the scale of devastation that we're talking about. When my colleague there has lost people and family in there, that tells you the magnitude. We're talking about 10 people. That's nothing. But that's the magnitude of loss that we are talking about, and destruction. The other part that puts actually a very important onus on universities, on the region, to take actually a responsibility, an ethical responsibility. Forget about the politics. What do we do at this particular moment? How do we actually make it possible that our universities, our research institutes become places where displaced scholars, whoever is still alive and surviving, can join us and come and teach and be there and give them the space to be able to do that? This is not simply a rhetoric about let's open our site, but actually to act on it as a very important part. How do we participate and collaborate in the production of knowledge as things are unfolding, whereby different people take responsibilities in different ways? It is not possible anymore to think that of the single author or the one institution that has to do it all. It's about being able to stretch out and figure out how to do this collectively.
Yeah, I think these are really important challenges for us to take on. And yeah, I agree. It's atrocious that U.S. universities have not taken this on, in the same way that it's atrocious that U.S. journalistic organizations are not highlighting, the genocide against Palestinian journalists, as Shuruk Assad was writing about. But I also want to just highlight, I mean, another element of the destruction of higher ed is, of course, the destruction of K through 12 education. Of course, no children in Gaza have been in school since for 6 months, right? The school year was canceled in, I believe, like November, right? They're automatically losing, aside from trauma, loss, so forth, like a year of education, right? These children automatically, and we know it's going to be more than a year with the scale of destruction, as we see so many schools turned into shelters. We see schools and universities that have been turned into prisons and military camps. I mean, this is a shocking militarization of everyday Palestinian places, right? Of learning, weaponized by the Israeli occupation, And I just also want to, again, to sort of turn momentarily to the West Bank to think about how, the Palestinian Authority is not paying salaries to teachers, not honoring strikes over the last few years. I mean, it's been years of interrupted education for these children. So when those children hit higher ed, they're not going to be coming equipped with what they should be equipped with for, again, a Palestinian society that has treasured and worked so hard to create these educational institutions. And I really find that heartbreaking, obviously for all the children in Gaza, but even more widely than this. Well, could I just say one more quickly about place, which is that I stand by what I was saying about refugee camps for sure, but I do think that, we can do this work really in any Palestinian place. Thinking about, other places to which, villages and so forth, and the Northern Galilee, these are places, in some ways, the easiest place to sort of think about with nostalgia in my case, as I am from one of those villages. But these places are also under threat. They also have important histories to uncover. And they also have people who are connected to, villages as well as cities and multiple places. So I think that sort of the things that I was trying to say about refugee camps are not only about refugee camps. They can be about other places too, and we need to attend with the same care to, villages and cities as well.
So there's one last question that we have, and then perhaps we can open it I have a couple of questions I thought we can raise at the end and maybe open the discussion among the panelists. A question about BDS. BDS has been an important political tool for action and intellectual dissent. What else can be done? Can we be doing to push the limits of BDS within and beyond academia? Is there still use to BDS as a tool today? And I think this is a question a lot of people are asking, who are not actually had not been activists for Palestine before.
Amahl?
Go ahead, please. Sorry.
Well, I think BDS, at least from our space in Egypt, is very, very, very important because it does two things. It provides us with a framework to talk about particular histories of struggle with and for Palestine, as well as South Africa, that would have not been possible. So it's a space to open up onto the question of time and resistance and struggle in very different ways. So that's a more of a pedagogical, and how BDS has been part of the whole node of ways to struggle and resistance that maybe younger generation who are very much into the BDS movement right now are not aware of. So that's one. The other part, I would argue, it's a very important move with regard to our institution, at least universities where we are working. And this is one of the things that we have been pushing for at AUC very much so, in collaboration with the BDS movement in Palestine, as well as BDS Egypt. And those are the kinds of spaces, without elaboration, that I was hinting to. What is it and how do we collaborate with the outside of the university in order to be able to bring about the revisiting of what is it that the academy and the university itself needs to do. And BDS has been one node for us in Egypt along these ways, being part of campus, being involved in the campaigns to divest from particular companies, to stop and successfully to stop two companies that had been part of that had been on the list for quite some time. And I think also we take our we here, I mean, what is happening at AUC in collaboration with Palestine BDS and Egypt BDS, but also other universities, because the national landscape in Egypt is very important. AUC is among one of the almost only institution of higher learning university that has still a space where people can utter and speak. National universities are operating under very heavy arm of surveillance and securitization by the state. And hence, how do you actually work around that in order to be able to produce and effect certain transformation is the very important question. And that's what boycott and the BDS movement in general has done.
Amahl?
I would just highlight that I really appreciate that perspective. And I would just add that I think boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements have been really great for building networks and educating people and doing outreach. And so I think all of those things continue to be of vital importance. And also that, we maybe in academia have focused on the boycott of the BDS movement, but I mean, there's space for divestment and of course of sanctions as well. And so I think that we can use that whole suite of strategies to combat Israeli apartheid. And I would just also highlight a new book by Maya Wind called The Towers of Ivory and Steel that speak to the complicity of Israeli institutions of higher ed in the occupation and apartheid. And so, there's a lot of tools out there to keep pushing this agenda.
Ussama, do you want to add something to this?
I agree with what's been said. All I would say is that the point is that it's BDS is one of many different strategies, and the most important thing is to use one's voice. I mean, that is what we have in our writing and our speaking, and people do it in very different ways. And so I'm less fixated on one particular avenue, although I think BDS is important. I think it's more that there is a huge potential that we have. I keep thinking of how many, and of course you're talking BDS means, although Hanan said Egypt, BDS Egypt, or but the point is that BDS is overwhelmingly in the West, because in the Arab world, for example, well, there is anti-normalization now, but there is this question of the huge potential and the human capital that we have in terms of there is just there's so much untapped potential in terms of how many young people are actually, the more we humanize, the more there are sort of younger people who educate people about Palestine, whether through BDS or just through basic human contact, the Zionist narrative crumbles ever more. I think that's which is why we see the Israelis sort of escalating their genocidal tactics now, because they feel that time is running out for them. And so there's something to be thought about that in terms of it's a race against time in a certain way. And they're trying to finish so-called the job in a moment right now, because they understand that just in terms of the numbers of people, just think about how many kids we have and how many people we know and how many friends they have and how much more Palestine has become part of a global discourse in the last 20, 30 years than it was before.
So there are a couple of questions that came up that I've been sort of mulling through from your talks. One is the question of coloniality. I mean, we can no longer keep talking about post-colonial, because we live in a very colonial moment, and it appears to be actually a global moment that we're living through. And the second thing that came through from all your presentations is that there's a serious challenge to hierarchies within the academy and within journalism that appears to have sustained itself for now 6 months, but that has roots, at earlier solidarities that have been building for some time in the United States. I don't know as much about Europe and Egypt. So what the question for all of us to think, what does Palestine, how can this solidarity be sustained? What are the mechanisms of sustaining it when at some point the killing stops? I mean, I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter. In the United States, Black Lives Matter created tremendous solidarities across the racial lines, but then it went away. It went away, and there was a huge reaction against it. The reaction that we see now in the United States and the rise of neo-fascist discourse, and legislation. So what I'm trying to come to grips with, how do we sustain this after the killing stops? So that's the question. That's all. I don't know if you're wiser to it. You're wiser than me about this. This is the.
I don't think we have to. I mean, I think it's going to take on Dina. The answer is, are you speaking specifically in the West, in Western academia? Is this what you mean?
Western academia and in Jordan and Egypt. I mean,
Jordan and Egypt. I think Hanan can speak to Egypt. But in Western academia, I think there's. I'm not. Obviously, there's a huge reaction right now, and there's a massive backlash taking place right now on each and every one of our campuses against Palestinian solidarity, trying to criminalize it, trying to make it out as anti-Semitic, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, I'm not especially concerned about the future in this particular way, because students are ahead of us in a certain way. I mean, they're not. I shouldn't say ahead of that. Maybe that's too paternalistic. But the students are mobilizing, and they're going to continue to mobilize now and in the future, because Palestine has become part and parcel, as everyone has been saying, has gone from being an Arab question to being a global question. And it's not just third world question, it's a global question now. And you see it having resonances around the world. And I think that's what's changed. And that's going to continue changing. And it's going to continue to escalate. It's not going to go away, no matter how much repression there is on this campus or any other campus. That's done. I think we're in a new phase. When the killing ends, before the killing ends, as the killing continues, it's going to continue. That doesn't mean it's going to succeed necessarily in the short term, but something has broken, something has shifted, and it's a question of seeing where this goes. So I don't think there's any prescription to give. I think it's just something to note that this has become a global question. It's a global way of thinking. It's a global solidarity, and it's going to continue.
Dina, I think my response would be, although there will never be a good response for your question, the response to number two, the solidarity to be sustained, is in number one, the coloniality of the present. In the sense that no matter what happens, by precisely having the coloniality that we're all living through right now, reach these levels of brutality and madness that make any language impossible. I think that ways of solidarity will continue in manners that we are not yet capable of thinking about right now. And that's the question of the potential that becomes very important, because every single day we're seeing things that are emerging that haven't been thought about the day before. And that's precisely because of the intensity of the situation in that sense. And if we think about how I mean, the three interlocutors that I was reading with in order to join you today were Annibal Quijano, the coloniality book, Madness is a Place, which is about African-American experience, and Achille Mbembe, Brutality. And I think the titles of those three sum it up. What is it that constitutes the present that actually is simultaneously a past and a virtual future that is in the happening? And the change of that, the solidarity of it, is precisely the question of what nodes become possible within that, around different questions. Now it is Palestine with the intensity that is about it, but also about not forgetting the other questions that are equally important. Syria is not too long ago. Yemen is still happening. Sudan is happening simultaneously. What's happening in Chile, what's happening in it's about being able to think in terms of the connections of what this moment has produced.
Yeah, I agree with all of that has been said. And I would say, I mean, maybe we are at this point, perhaps a lot of professors on the call, you know, maybe it's also a time for us to reach out to some of our colleagues who don't naturally teach about Palestine. You know, after, God willing, you know, the hot part of this war or genocide cooled down a little bit, it's time to reach out and say, you know, actually you can teach Palestine across your curriculum, right? You know, to some of the people who might be like watching and stunned, but maybe not jumping in, you know, so there might be more people, different kinds of people who can be mobilized now, or next year, for example. I also think that, yeah, thinking about environment and health is something that we may not have done intuitively, talking about Palestine, I don't know, 5 years ago, but we see again how important these dimensions are in order to understanding this chapter in dispossession. So yeah, I agree that there are sort of new dimensions that are always emerging that we'll be able to engage, and that will also sort of engage new people. Yeah.
Well, I think we're 4 minutes into the end of our session. So I want to thank all of you for the generosity of your time and for your ideas and for agreeing to join us. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm glad we're thinking in terms of solidarities and perpetual and different options of thinking of the future. And I think on that note, we can end this session. I don't know, Rula, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Akid. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you, Dr. Dina. Thank you to the interpreters and for everyone who joined us. Stay tuned till next month. We have the 5th webinar in the Thinking Critically with Palestine series. More information will be posted on our website and our social media platforms closer to the date. So stay tuned, and Ramadan Kareem, everyone. Oh, thank you for joining. Bye.
Bye-bye, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.